stuff for people to see. This is your own reflection. It's something that I want you to ponder on and, you know, keep in a safe spot and kind of as a reminder where you may want to focus on your own development after this. So let me begin by sharing my screen here. And I'm just going to keep it in this mode because sometimes when I run the presentation mode, it doesn't quite work right. So I want to begin. If you've been in any of my presentations, this is a definition. This is the definition of culture I used. And you can see it's actually a very old definition. It comes from 1979. And I actually learned about it from the book that this was out of in one of my multicultural classes, like in the early 90s. So I like this because it goes beyond talking about culture as something that we see on the outside, whether it be race, whether it be gender, whether it be ability levels as in disabilities, but it goes beyond that. And I'm not gonna read everything to you there, but it's more comprehensive because I think we forget when we talk about culture frequently that it is more than just what we see on the outside, but it is our attitudes, it's our rituals that we grew up with. One of the things in the definition, aesthetic standards. I always share this story, you know, I grew up in New Mexico and people say, oh, you grew up in New Mexico. I grew up in Santa Fe. And oh, you grew up in Santa Fe. Oh, it must be so pretty and everything. And I just kind of say, eh. I was never a fan of the desert. I was never a fan of the brown dirt. I was never a fan of the dried out look because we didn't have any water to use to water stuff. I remember as a little boy when we would cross over from Texas into Western Oklahoma out there by Eric, just kind of feeling revived, seeing the green of Oklahoma, the rolling hills, the wide open pastures, just those colors that I never saw in New Mexico because everything's all dried out and brown there. And I bring that up as an example because even aesthetic standards are part of who we are as individuals. And so as we talk about this, I want to encourage you to always remember that as we think about diversity, we also want to remember that it's things that we can't necessarily see. Which brings me to this slide. So some of the things that we can't always see that we probably should consider as housing status, and that kind of relates to our zip codes. And we've done a lot of research and education, just sorting students by zip code. And as you all know and probably have read, we can see a lot of varying educational outcomes based on zip code, based on where you live, based on your housing status, based on if there were other educational facilities in the area, whether there was healthcare in the area, whatever it may be. But we do know the area of town or city or part of the country we grow up in does influence how we see the world and how we interact in the world. Obviously, age and gender is still a big piece. Related to all of this is our socioeconomic status. One of the workshops I'm doing in this fall is around privilege and power. And even as a person of color, because my parents had gone to college and had doctoral degrees, and it led us to be able to have a certain socioeconomic status that other people of color that look like me did not have. So I recognize that, and I recognize that influences education. Insurance is a big one. Whether it's your own physical care or, we see cases where it's bankrupt people because they did not have health insurance. But again, another way that communities are diverse that influences what we see happening in classrooms or working with other individuals. Mental health is a big one. That's one of the big ones I'm push. I think it's an area of diversity we really do need to give a lot of attention to today. Some of you may have viewed my mental health kind of take care of yourself during this COVID-19 period time on YouTube. We just put up a larger one for teachers on how to work with students with mental health issues. But I think that that's one area of diversity that we need to be aware of, that we need to be conscious about, that we need to respect, that we need to be inclusive about, that we need to have some knowledge about, as well. Learning and other cognitive disabilities, sexual orientation and gender identity, religion, and there's probably many others that we could put up here. My point in this slide wasn't necessarily to be, you know, comprehensive in every single solitary way that we're different, but just to remind us all that it's, you know, in the past we've tended to look at it based on the color of people's skin or their gender, or, you know, if someone were in a wheelchair or have a hearing disability or blind. It's what we can see on the outside we tend to use and define as culture, and it can be so much more. So this slide is one that I use quite a bit too. And again, I can send any of these to you. I like this because it's a very simplistic way of thinking about cultural awareness. I'm going to show it's maybe a little bit more complicated than this, but this is a nice thing. When I give it out at workshops, I put it on cardstock, print it on cardstock, and make sure to tell teachers, you know, because we all think if it's on cardstock, it's more important because it's heavier paper, to tape it up where they can see this every day. But as you can see here, you know, cultural awareness is first of all about being aware of people who are different from us, being aware of what makes them different from us, understanding those differences, not only within others, but also in ourselves. And we're going to be doing some of that today in the workshop. And then once we know about those differences and being aware and understanding where potentially we may be discriminatory or judging people or acting on mental models that are outdated, to make those changes that, you know, begin with changing the way we think and then implementing those changes. And as you can see from the model and from this arrow down here at the bottom here, once we go through this, the intention is that we just keep growing in this area. And let me just say to you, all of you as well, I mean, this is something I'm always challenging myself with. I mean, I will surprise myself at an area where maybe I have been discriminatory or I've prejudged someone, and I'm thinking, wow, I didn't realize that. And so this is something that I keep, you know, in my mind too. So I'm not perfect. This has worked for me, and that's why I want to kind of share it with you. So we're going to talk about these different stages, and this is where I'm going to get you all involved. You aren't going to have to blurt out answers as I shared with you. This is for your reflection, for you to think about in your own lives. But in order, I think, for us to be more inclusive, to be ready to interact with others who are different, it first begins with looking at ourselves. And just so you know, kind of how I structured today, then to go along with the 3 sessions I've got in the fall, this is kind of, it's kind of all fits together. So we'll look at ourselves today, and then if you join me in any of the other sessions this fall, we'll kind of start looking at larger groups and communities at large. So begins with awareness of beliefs, understanding where those bases of beliefs came from, revisions of beliefs, and then implement the changes. So the way that I do this, and as I shared with you, in all my classes, and obviously in the classes I taught that focus specifically on social justice and equity in education, I would always have my students reflect and do an exercise where they had to identify their value system, figure out where that came from, and then figure out changes they wanted to make. And I'm going to kind of have you do that too in more of a simplified fashion, although you can keep building on this even after the workshop is over. But the way I would always do this is starting with some questions. Move over here. And so I want you to think about these. And again, be honest with yourself, because the only way that we create change, the only way that we become inclusive and understanding of differences is by first of all looking at ourselves. Remember, we're after that 2020 vision. And we aren't going to have 2020 vision until we kind of know where our vision needs to be adjusted. So think about this. Do you believe individuals different from you deserve the same opportunities as you? If so, which ones? If not, which ones? We know, and we're seeing this in the world today, that there are people who definitely, and it's very clear, believe that if you are different in some way, color of your skin, ability level, sexual orientation, whatever it may be, health, whether or not you have health insurance, that you do not deserve what others who have that privilege do or lack thereof. Think about where potentially you believe that, and make some notes of that and be aware of that, because it begins by thinking about groups of individuals where we think of those differences. And I kind of got off track because I was thinking of an example, but a good example I think that kind of relates to this is, we kind of, this is something that's followed us in vocational technical and career technical as the name changed. But, thinking that people, who went to VOTech, career tech didn't deserve what people who went to college did, for example. That's one of the big ones that we still fight to this day. Or if you didn't go to college, you don't deserve something in terms of employment, or that women deserve less pay than men, or a person of color doesn't deserve the same voting rights, whatever it may be. Ask yourself, who are those individuals that I oftentimes, or I frequently, or I consistently just really feel like they don't deserve the same thing as I do? Are you fearful of individuals different from you? If so, which individuals? I was sharing this story in the previous workshop. I had a doctoral student, one of my doctoral students. She was a white woman, grew up, worked, lived, never left one of the wealthiest suburbs of Chicago. She worked in a community college, and she had been for a number of years a computer science professor and technology professor. But she had come back to do doctoral work because she wanted to eventually be a dean, assistant vice president, and potentially a president of a community college. She had made it up to department head, but she didn't go any further without a doctorate. And so she was taking one of my classes in social justice and education. And one of the assignments, as I shared, was was to go out and find an individual, a group of individuals, a community that you did not know a lot about, and learn about them. And I would give some questions to get them started, but I also wanted them to figure out those areas. But to spend some time, immerse yourself in that culture, find out a little bit more about them, and then they would write it up and kind of report out on it. So she'd been my student for about a year, and this was more of an advanced class. But I remember one day after class on Saturday, I was teaching 4 weekends, Fridays and Saturdays. And one Saturday after class was over with, before she left to go back home, she came, she said, "Can I talk to you?" And I said, "Yeah." And I could see her shaking and see her nervous about it. And she just said, "I need to tell you something, and I'm so embarrassed about it. And I don't want to offend you, and you're probably going to hate me." And I just finally said, "What? You need to just tell me." She said, "I have a fear. I've been scared all my life of gay people." And she knew I was gay. And she said, "I'm embarrassed to tell." And then the tears just started flowing. She just cried and cried and cried because she was so ashamed of herself. And I said, "Look, you do not have to be embarrassed. You do not have to be ashamed." I said, and she said, she was telling me about her son who lives in New York City. And when they go back there, because he lived close to one of the gay communities, how she would always be fearful and not want to go eat in restaurants there and stay away. And so I explained to her, I said, this would be a perfect project for a perfect group for your assignment. Because I said, you know, and because we've been talking about how beliefs are formed, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And I just said, you know, learn about this particular group. I said, I'm not offended. I'm not the least bit offended. I'm not going to drop you as my advisee. I'm still going to work with you if you want to work with me, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So I'll tell you a little bit more about that story later because it builds on what we're going to talk about in a minute as well. So this was an example of having to admit that you're fearful. Some other examples I always share with that, I see this all the time. You're, you know, downtown in Oklahoma City, Tulsa, wherever, downtown Stillwater, and you see someone walking around who clearly does have a mental illness, probably some psychosis, but they're talking to someone, they're having a conversation as if someone's standing there right next to them, and our typical response is usually to go around them, walk the other way, turn the other direction, or, you know, the stories are real where you see someone, where I've known people who see a person of color walking one way and they clutch their purse or their cell phone or whatever, or turn down the street or go into a building, whatever. And I think it's really important for us to be aware of those situations where we do have fear. And remember, fear is always fixed with information. We can always fix fear, but we have to admit where those fears lie. And it doesn't matter if you're you know, I'm fearful of rattlesnakes. I grew up in New Mexico. I was always afraid I was going to be bitten by a rattlesnake. You know, we all have fears. You know, I had relatives that would go to the cellar when the storms were in western Oklahoma. They had such a fear. But if we, you know, so it doesn't have anything to do with just race or anything or diversity. Anything that we're afraid of, information can always fix. So we always have to begin by talking about where our fears lie. Do you believe individuals different from you are not as capable as you? If so, which individuals? One of the cool opportunities I had when I was at the University of New Mexico, Illinois, was working with the some of the students from the Paralympic group, and that's the group of athletes who have physical disabilities. And so all of their sports are modified for them. And the last doctoral student I graduated was a paraplegic, but she was rated one of the fastest women in the world as a wheelchair sprinter. In fact, she took the title back from the Chinese competitors. But you know, with working with them, I got to go to the Paralympics in London in 2012, which happened 2 weeks after the Olympics. But it was through that I got to see how much discrimination exists against people with disabilities. You know, from trying to find a place to park, to checking into a hotel, to getting on an airplane, to finding a restaurant they can go to, or a curb cut, or not having to, you know, park way off and you know, they actually use the term walk to the door, even if they're in a wheelchair. And it just really opened my eyes how much there are people out there that thought people with disabilities just aren't capable. And so we know that exists as well. You know, potentially people who just go to, I hate to use, sorry, that came out wrong, who go to community college or career tech programs. You know, we're still fighting that stigma of you know, community college, career tech is not as good as going to a four-year school. So we want to think about those. Are you fearful as opportunities increase for individuals different from you, your opportunities will decrease? This, I think, is one of the big fears and one of the big reasons for issues around, especially obviously equity in our society. And when we talk about that, we're talking about not just race, but we're talking about people, you know, women, we're talking about people with a different education than us, or a different socioeconomic status than us, or if someone moves up, someone else has to move down. And again, fear can be corrected with knowledge. And, you know, one of the things that we know, and I think especially in the field of career tech, is that there's opportunity out there for everyone who wants it. And we can help create that. But part of that is helping to change those beliefs. But again, for all of us individually, we need to change that. And just another personal story for me. And, I mean, I have to say this came from my parents. I don't know, it's the only place that it could come from. But, I grew up, and maybe you did too. I admit this, and it came from my parents, that to be fearful of the restaurants that we would call kind of holes in the wall. Maybe you use that term to describe, and they were usually the restaurants like next to the TGNY or the Woolworth, or next to the whatever, the party store and the strip mall. And it was usually in an older storefront, and maybe the building, the door wasn't very nice or had a crack in it, and the tables were older, but whatever. It didn't look like the Olive Garden, for lack of a better description. And I was always told, you don't eat in those restaurants because, they don't cook the food as well, and they aren't as clean, and blah, 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 blah. And of course, that stuck with me. When I moved to Illinois and I'd go to Chicago, and I went up with some friends once, we were going to grab some lunch, and we were downtown Chicago. And we started into one of those hole in the wall restaurants, and I backed up and I said, no way am I eating in there. And they asked me why. And so I went through my spiel of, I was going to get food poison and we all die and blah, 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 blah. And then I had to use logic. First of all, I had to be aware of that belief. I had to be aware that that belief was operating in my head, even though, I didn't think I was a discriminatory person or a prejudiced person, but it was certainly there. So I had to start implementing logic. And the logic that I used, I thought, well, okay, real estate in downtown Chicago is super expensive. If these places were not making money because they were poisoning everyone who ate there, or their food wasn't any good, they would not be open, and they wouldn't have been open for years and years and years. So therefore, they must be okay to eat at. And it changed my whole thinking. And now, those are the places I love to eat, those small little places, hidden places. I drive from Stroud to Stillwater, when we are teleworking, and in Cushing, right there at 33 and by the Best Western, is Chewy's Burrito. And they have the best breakfast burritos there ever. And, had I had that old mindset, I would have never stopped at Chewy's and gotten their breakfast burrito. But those are the best breakfast burritos ever. So now occasionally when I go to the office, when we're still in the office, I stop there and get one. But the point is it made me have to be aware of that fear I had of those restaurants, understand, going on to this next slide, where those fears came from. I had to admit, third point, we'll go back through these others, but it came from my parents, and then to take some action with that. So moving to this slide. So we're now aware of our fears, we're aware of our beliefs, but I think it's also important to understand where those came from, and to be okay, and to understand that just because it came from our parents, or came from the church, or came from our grandparents, or came from whomever, it is okay that they're wrong, and it is okay to change them. I think I talk to so many people that say, well, that's how I was brought up. If I do something different, it goes against, that's okay, because you're you, we're all us, and we have a right to have the beliefs that are appropriate for us. But I think it's important to ask yourself, do you see issues in dichotomies? Do you see it as yes, no, right, wrong, both literally and figuratively, as black, white, better, worse, more or less, whatever it may be. If you see those dichotomies, I think we need to challenge ourselves to see the continuum, to make sure to remember that there's a continuum that separates those two endpoints, and to be open to seeing what's on that continuum and letting ourselves let some of that fear down and exposing ourselves to something that's on some of that continuum. So I would encourage you to look again at maybe some of your thinking, how you were raised, how you were taught, how you taught in the classroom, whatever that may be. Just say, do I sometimes think about dichotomies? And if so, is that good? Is it bad? Do I need to look in between? What do I need to do? Did you have a negative interaction with an individual different from you? You know, it's the analogy, one bad apple doesn't upset the whole bushel or whatever it is, the whole barrel. And I've met a number of people, and I've certainly experienced this in myself in the past, where you meet someone who is different from you, whether it's based on ability, race, religion, sexual orientation, political party, whatever it may be, and you get the bad taste in your mouth from that experience. And so everyone who has that title or falls within that group must be the same way. I'm not going to have anything to do with any of them. And we obviously want to make sure that we don't do that, because again, one bad apple doesn't upset the whole bushel or whatever the saying is. What messages did you hear from your parents, teachers, friends, extended family, et cetera, growing up? You know, again, I heard about the restaurants, but I also heard about the importance of going to college. And so that was, you know, something very important to me. But the point of that question is that it is okay that if you heard it from, you know, somebody that you consider an authority figure, that it is okay to change that. And it is okay to conclude, you know, maybe that wasn't the right way to think about this. Maybe that's an old-fashioned way to think about it. And I'm okay with changing the way I think about it. Another question that I think is really, really important, especially when we talk about differences, is what are your sources of information regarding individuals different from you? Do you take the time to fact check? Do you check the reputation of the source? Do you compare information from multiple sources? If you had a chance to look at, and I alluded to it on the previous slide, if you had a chance to watch the mental health, a little 15-minute that was on YouTube that I talked about the fact that a lot of the anxiety that we experience, a lot of the fear we experience, and it doesn't, again, just happen in the COVID-19 quarantine environment, but interacting with people who are different, oftentimes comes from lack of information or a prejudgment. And one of the best things that we can do is to use research, to look at the sources where we're getting the information, to compare it across multiple sources before we come to a conclusion. One of the things I love about being in Oklahoma is, believe it or not, is I have access to McBride Orthopedics Hospital in Oklahoma City, because it's one of the best in the country, and I have an arthritic shoulder that I've had for a number of years. But when I was wanting to find a doctor up there at McBride, I didn't just, you know, go and the first one pops up, make an appointment with him. But what I did was I went through and looked at all of the orthopedic doctors whose primary focus was on shoulders. And I went through and looked at where did they go to college, you know, where did they do their internships, had they published anything, what was the reputation of the journal they published in, tried to find something they had written about. And the reason for that is because I wanted to ensure I had all the information to make an informed decision, so that my thinking about the situation was accurate, that I could actually go to this doctor and say, hey, I really do think you are the best for what I need, versus just picking someone. So I encourage you to, you know, when you are looking and wanting to understand more about differences, regardless of what that difference is. I mean, I was using this example in the other class. We won't even buy a car without doing a lot of research on it. Yet we will make judgments against people or ideas or communities that are different from us based on one thing or lack of information. And we all need to make sure that we're challenging ourselves to get as much comprehensive information as we can before we make that final decision for what's right with us in terms of how we want to think about the issue. And then last slide here, and then we'll open it up for discussion and share a little bit more stories if you want. you know, once you go through the awareness, once you understand where those came from, then you can really think about what needs to be changed in your thinking as you approach that. As I shared with you, you know, I had to think very differently and come to grips that my parents hadn't educated me well on restaurants, and that was okay. Uh, I had to realize that I needed to use better logic and get more information to come up with that. So I do that. I learned not that I was discriminatory or prejudiced against people with disabilities when I was working with some of the students with disabilities at the University of Illinois, but what I realized is that my mental model was about this wide. And as a result, it really expanded and got this big, and I'm still learning about it. That teacher that I was telling you about, what ended up with her, or that student, um, is really exciting. The first thing that happened very early on is I would always have students over to my house because I taught, like I said, I taught the class 4 weekends, Friday nights, and all day Saturday. And so usually I would have them over on a Friday night, like the second or third Friday night, just for a social event. We'd make pizzas and talk about the readings and just have a nice event. And I think it kind of helped her because I think she thought she'd come to my house and see a scene out of The Birdcage, if you remember that movie, and was very pleasantly surprised. It was tastefully decorated. I will take that stereotype. Um, but it was not like pink flamingos and Pepto-Bismol pink all over, and boas and fluffy pillows and anything like that. And I think that was a start for her. But she challenged herself. She pushed herself to meet other LGBTQ individuals starting at her school. And by the end of the semester, her fear was gone. She had started the first ally program at the community college where she was at and was just the champion for it. She helped write the ally curriculum. She was training the other teachers in the program. And then that winter, that Christmas, when they went to see their son in New York, she was all about going to the Chelsea district and Hell's Kitchen and what all the other areas were. And then I guess they took a ferry ride around the area, and she talked to some gay men, and her son even said, "You do know they're gay, right?" And she said yes, and you know, told them all about her program. And I mean, she now is the biggest champion for LGBTQ, but it was that fear and basing an experience. So that was how that story happened, and that ties into a couple of items down here. So again, what beliefs, mental models need revision? What are the actual revisions that need to be made? So, you know, it's one thing to realize that you may prejudge or you may discriminate, but it's another thing to think about, okay, now what do I need to do to ensure that I don't keep doing this? What do I need to do to make sure that I am inclusive, that I do look at others from various perspectives and understand who they are? And here are some ideas. This again is not meant to be comprehensive necessarily. I think volunteering is one of the best ways that we can learn about others. Find, you know, and I know it's kind of hard right now given, you know, that we're still in quarantine and we have to be careful. But when you get a chance, you know, volunteer, even if you find something to volunteer online. I think there's a lot of good initiatives that, you know, as we have done, we're putting stuff online, other things have too. You know, purposely put yourself out there to meet people who are different, to learn about them. Information interviews, you know, just find out and don't be afraid of it. I mean, most people who are different want to tell you about their experiences, want to tell you who they are, and teach you about their culture. And so I've gone up and say, hey, you know, tell me what it's like I remember when I interviewed at the University of, sorry, all these things pop into my head. I remember when I interviewed at the University of Illinois for my faculty job back in 1996 or whatever it was. And the dean of the College of Education was an African-American woman. She was late 50s, early 60s. She was actually going to be retiring soon. But I remember, I'd gone through all these interviews and I was exhausted, and we got down to her time. She was the last interview of the day. And she said, well, what questions do you have for me? And I was just mentally done at that point. And I said, what I want to know actually is, how did a Black woman from Mississippi become the dean of one of the top research universities, colleges of education at one of the top research universities in this country? And it did not offend her. She told me her story. And I bring that up because oftentimes we're afraid to ask people. You see someone in a wheelchair. And I used to be this way, should I open the door? Should I do this? Should I do that? And so I asked, do you want me to open the door for you? Or do you want me to, I forget some of the other things. And it was the perfect response. My friend just said, well, if you would do this for an able-bodied person, yeah, do it for me, but don't do it for me because you feel sorry for me, because I can do it for myself. And so don't be afraid to ask people to tell you their stories. I love sharing my stories, you can tell. I've got many more stories I can tell you about, being told to be careful about driving in northern Memphis by myself because of the Ku Klux Klan might be after me one time. I've been told to go back to Mexico by a group of teachers when I was doing some teacher training. So if you want to know about any of those things, I can tell you. But do it for the right reason, of course. I mean, do it because you want to learn, because you want to be more knowledgeable, not because you want to feel sorry for somebody. And one of the things I put up here too is, when we listen to stories, we aren't always the best listeners, and I put myself in that category. We listen physically, but we don't listen intellectually or with our hearts. I always say that when someone wants to tell you their story, or you ask to hear it, we really need to sit down, turn our phones off, turn to that person, look them in the eye, and really listen. And always remember that hearing someone's story, someone telling you their story, can be one of the greatest gifts we can ever receive, because we get to learn, and we get to learn more about them. And usually based on someone else's story, we get to learn about ourselves. So I always say, ask people to tell you their story, but be ready to hear it, give your full attention to it. And then finally, just what changes will you make as a result? Maybe you need to volunteer more. Maybe you need to take more time to do research when you're approached with someone who's different. Maybe you need to sit down and ask someone to share their story. Maybe you do need to change a specific behavior you have, or an attitude you have, whatever that may be. And as I shared with you in the beginning, I'm not going to have you share anything that you wrote down unless you want. I mean, if you have a story you want to share, if that relates, feel free. But I want you to reflect on this. As you're probably aware, diversity, equity, and inclusion comes out of the affect domain. It's not it's some cognitive, but we certainly can't say, at the end of this workshop on race, you'll respect people in wheelchairs 9 out of 10 times. That doesn't make sense. We can't put that down like we can say, after this, after attending something else, you'll score 90%. Some of those things make sense. But it's really about what's in your heart, what's in your mind, and to ask yourself where those changes need to be made. I think I'll end right now with my stuff, see what questions, comments, thoughts. Let me stop sharing so I can get back to the chat. Thoughts, reactions, questions. I'll share just another story to show kind of too how, again, but I have to work on this as well. I have a number of friends, you know, in my generation, you know, being out wasn't the thing. And I have a lot of friends in my generation that are fearful, that are still in the closet. And I don't understand that. I grew up in Santa Fe, as I shared with you, and that again is power and privilege that I have when it comes to my friends who like grew up here in Oklahoma or in Tennessee or other places. Um, you know, Santa Fe, if you are not aware, is actually the gay capital of the U.S. It's not San Francisco because proportionally there's more LGBTQ in Santa Fe than there is San Francisco. And there's a lot of national conventions that happen in Santa Fe. So growing up, you know, no big deal seeing two guys holding hands, two girls holding hands, transgender people, people in drag, whatever it may be. So no big deal to me. And I really didn't know I was different in terms of my skin color till I left New Mexico, because of course everyone looked like me. And I get to the University of Illinois in Champaign in the middle of a cornfield in the middle of winter and think I've moved to hell. And it's not because it was minus 30 degrees that first winter when I was trying to walk across campus, but it was because I saw no one who looked like me. And so even at that age, with my knowledge, with my education, with my socioeconomic status, with every tool that you would assume would equip me for that, I was not equipped for it. But going back to this other thing, you know, I've had, and again, I don't share this because I want your sympathy. I share this for understanding purposes, for awareness. I've had so much discrimination in my life based on skin color that I've never had a chance to be discriminated against for being sexual minority. So I always tease people and tell people I don't even get that chance to be gay, if you will. I only get a chance to be brown. And so I get onto my friends, my white friends who are in the closet, and I say, you know, you're setting us back and you aren't helping the cause. And, you know, why should you have the privileges that I'm willing to put myself out there, you know, and I get onto my soapbox and I have to watch that because that's what happens to me. Because I don't understand that. I don't understand being discriminated against based on sexual orientation because that's never happened. It's always, you know, I've always gotten thrown out the door long before based on skin color, not literally, figuratively, but based on skin color. And so that's an area, believe it or not, that I really have to watch myself when I'm around my white sexual minority friends, because it's like, you know, you are not helping, but you got to get out there. You got to fight for the cause. You got to blah, blah, blah. And I just get on my soapbox like that. And then I have to stop and think, hey, wait, my experience was very different than someone else's. And so I try to understand, you know, growing up in very small towns or in certain parts of the country where it was not accepted, where there were not role models, where there was not examples, or whatever it may be. And so it happens to all of us. So let me just say, I put myself up here too. I may talk about this stuff, but it's something that I work on. I challenge myself with. I look for stuff inside my being and my head where I need to change as well. So it's not pointing a finger. It's making sure that we're all really pushing ourselves to think about these issues. So with that, I'll see if there are any questions, comments, thoughts, and so on. Anything else you want to talk about?
Stephen, I'm not sure where to start with all of this because I think it's hard to know where my own prejudices lie, and I think we all have a blind spot because none of us think we're prejudiced. So I don't know how to start that investigation of, you know, well, obviously I think I'm perfect and obviously I'm not. So I don't know what to do.
Okay, so here's some things I would have you take a look at. One of the things that you can do is to look at the types of businesses you frequent. Do you frequent minority-owned businesses? Would you go, for example, to the east side of Oklahoma City and shop in the African-American businesses there? What restaurants do you eat at? What literature do you read? What do your friends look like? What movies do you watch? Are you interested in actually learning about differences? And I think that if you take the time, it was kind of like that awareness with me with the restaurant example. You know, and actually, you know, and oftentimes too, let me back up too, it oftentimes finding someone that you feel close enough with to say, hey, will you point this out to me? Because it is hard to see it. It is hard to oftentimes see, especially when we've grown up in a certain environment, when we have seen things from one perspective all of our lives, to be able to do that. And I would have never had realized my issue with, you know, and I joke about it with the hole in the wall restaurants, but that was really bad to see entrepreneurs that way until someone pointed that out for me. And so if there's someone that can do that, but just, I think, pay attention to when something is different. How do you respond to that? What do you like bristle with that? Do you get an eerie feeling when you see someone at the grocery store or walking down the street in a parking lot that's different? Do you kind of run the other way? I think being conscious of those things and watching for them will give you a lot of insight with that. And like I said, if you find someone that you trust, that you feel confident with, that you want to be vulnerable with, because that is part of it, ask that person to help you with that. I think oftentimes too, you know, just purposely putting yourself into situations that are different, because when you put yourself into a situation that's different purposely, you'll see how you respond. You're going to automatically see, is this comfortable? Am I a little scared? What's going on with me? And then that'll kind of give you a gauge as well with it. So practice, you know, you don't have to just throw yourself, you know, get on a plane and go to you know, Mexico or wherever. But just start in your own community. Start going places that are different. Start being around people. Go to the college campus and walk around. I think, you know, being in a college town is awesome. I love that because of all the different cultures. You know, I don't know if I don't think I shared this in this one. I think I was talking to the other. I don't know how many of you get the Oklahoma City stations versus the Tulsa stations, but on Channel 5 on the ABC station, they were showing the story of this Black man who was going to the coffee shops in downtown Oklahoma City, just walking up to people and say, hey, can we talk a little bit about race? And you know that had to be scary for him, but it was a cool story to see because most people were very open to it and said, you know, I've always wanted to do this, but it was just, you know, I didn't know how. I thought I'd be offending someone if I did that. And usually if, you know, someone is fearful, you know, they're going to be fearful too, like you are. Start with me. You know, I'll tell you anything. You know, I've seen it all. I've probably experienced it all to some degree. I love to share my story, and because again, don't see it as feeling sorry for me because I have a great life. See it as education. And if you ever want to talk, let's talk. Does
Well,
that help?
and it does, except, I mean, I'm not going to argue with your perspective of being willing to talk, and I think that's wonderful. But I'm hearing now that, you know, your Black friends and acquaintances don't want to be the ones to teach you about racism right now, which, you know, I totally understand. And B, okay, I'm going to get into my own long story.
Mm-hmm.
Just by looking at me, you would think that I'm the whitest white to ever white, and you can't tell that my father is from the Middle East. So my husband and my daughter and I, who all look, you know, white bread, were at some food stand, and the man selling us food had a very familiar accent. And I said, you know, oh, where are you from? Because you sound like my family. And he said, I'm, you know, part Arab and part Italian. And I said, oh, well, okay, you know, my dad's from Iran, and your accent is very familiar to me. And then he was like, oh, yes, you know, I'm Iranian, and we were so happy to talk to each other, but he was afraid to share that with me until he knew that, that I wasn't going to yell, obscenities and insults at him. So, it's hard to expect people to open up to you.
Well, and that's a good point. I mean, right now in this climate, it may be harder to learn about African American culture. I still think there are probably some individuals who would love to share that with you. But, start with something else. Start with another group of individuals, and maybe not even based on race. Again, one of my big areas learning about was ability levels, disability ability, and opening my eyes, or just think about a particular group of individuals you don't know a lot about. Remember, that was my assignment I gave to my students. I would say it wasn't necessarily that they discriminated against them or that they were prejudiced, but they just simply didn't know a lot about them. And so, like, for example, I had one student in Illinois and learned about the Amish community. I had students that went and learned about, we had a lot of communities like that. A lot of the disability would go and learn about disabilities like I had. So even begin by thinking about where potentially it's not necessarily that you're discriminatory, but maybe where you're a little narrow in your thinking, and where you can expand that. Let's see. Looks like we may be frozen. Are we frozen? Is anyone still there?
You froze up for a minute, but okay. You're coming through now.
Did you get that? Did you hear?
Yes,
basically?
I think I got all of that. Yes.
Yeah.
I thought it was.
Start even just narrow, just like you did. Even starting with someone who sounds like you, because then you can build from that too. Because, like you said, he was probably feeling the same way you were with that. I don't know all about the Oklahoma Native American people, and I'm Native American, but from New Mexico. So, that's an area that, yes, I know something about, but not the Native American people in Oklahoma. And I have to watch myself with that because, Tracy, this kind of goes with your story. All New Mexico American Indians are dark like me. We were made, I guess, genetically to sit in the desert sun of New Mexico. So, we're all brown like me. But I come here and someone says I'm from the Cherokee Nation and they're as white can be, and it just causes me cognitive dissonance. And my first reaction is I want to think that they're lying to me. And so, see, that's where I have to kind of watch myself and not jump and prejudge. So it's in all of us, like you said. So think about where, potentially your thinking may not necessarily be discriminatory or prejudice, but maybe just a little narrow, because you can always start there too. That's another way to do it.
Just a thought.
Mm-hmm.
Sorry, just a thought. I don't want to interrupt you, but the PD sessions Becky was in charge of, I guess, kind of right before this whole COVID thing hit. The embrace, engage, and those. Something like that to do with diversity, where we take this group out to a community, would be probably helpful, because there's a lot of people you're going to have to force into this deal.
Yeah.
And once they get forced into it, I'm one of them. And not now, but back today, I was raised in a very singular. I was raised in a completely white neighborhood. Mm-hmm. I still remember seeing my first black person. I was probably 5 or 6, and I had to ask Mom what it was, and of course, that was back in the day, and she was like, no. Mm-hmm. So, through the years, I've gotten rid of that, but there's a lot of people that never had the opportunity to get rid of that. They were raised in one fashion, and they thought, it's the way it always should be, because it's the way it was. And
Yeah.
So I don't want to say drag these people into this, but I mean, put the opportunity out there to where
Right.
they can get into that setting. Mama E's, it's a restaurant on northeast side of Oklahoma City. I'm not sure if it's still there or not. I remember going there probably 5 or 6 years ago. It was amazing. I mean, I thought it was the coolest thing because all they had to drink was Kool-Aid or water. And I mean, it was just so simple, but I mean, it was an amazing restaurant. And I remember having an awesome conversation with the waitress there. And, me and my family, it was just kind of a chance to get a glimpse into their culture.
Right.
And so, I mean, I think once people get introduced to it, they're wide open to seeing other cultures. But it's just,
if we can just get over that fear piece, and we, again, fear, you overcome fear with good information, and that's why I push.
Yeah.
And too, like I said on that one slide, it really is okay that if we realize that we were raised by parents or had teachers or grandparents or friends or, our friends' parents who taught us something that maybe isn't the best way to think today, it is okay to reject that. And, to say, that wasn't, we don't have to accept everything. I mean, that's the free choice we have in our thinking. Again, I can look back, and even with one of the workshops this fall is on power and privilege. We're going to talk about that. The other one I've called Black Lives Matter versus All Lives Matter, because I want to talk about why that's important. And I forget what the third one was we put on there, but, I've realized too that it goes the other way. I mean, I'm very fortunate to have had two parents who were college professors, and one to have graduated from the wonderful University of Oklahoma, Lamesa. And because I could ask questions. I could ask questions about education, about colleges and why you go to certain colleges for certain reasons and all that. But it also, at the same time, made me limited in what I knew about other educational opportunities till I got to college myself and learned about those and really realized how this whole system of higher education and education works together very purposely and deliberately to do. And now I'm the first one. You drag me out there. I'm more than happy to be the first one to say not everyone has to go to college. And when I was in Illinois, career and tech ed was always in community colleges. There was some high school, but you was usually in community colleges, not career tech centers. So, we had that double thing. Not only were we promoting going to a community college, but we were promoting going to a career tech program in a community college. But we know that, those people make more money than we do put together, those kids. And so it's getting over that fear. It's getting the correct information. It's knocking down those old beliefs that, everyone has to do the exact same thing or be the exact same way. We just need to work on ways of getting rid of that. So I like that idea. I think we should go on field trips.
Oh, Stephen, you're going to make me unmute myself. And I've only been Black and I've only been a woman my whole life. I don't have any other experience. But on the flip side, I know this is a very interesting time, a time for a lot of internal soul searching, a lot of time for external exploration as to how we look at issues and address issues that some people deal with on a daily basis. Other people haven't thought about their entire lives. So the reason I put why it should not be a field trip, and yay, educational experience, getting to know people, because I don't want to think of I remember going to New Orleans right after Katrina, and they had bus loads, tours of people just going around to the different neighborhoods, looking at the destruction like it was, like they were on a field trip, like they were going to the museum or going to the zoo. And the reality is that's those people's lives.
Right.
And so I want to make sure
I absolutely get
that we go into situations like it can't just be a one and done. And we all have our own experiences.
Right.
I have my own experience about living here in Stillwater. You know, there are people who they can't wait to get to Stillwater. Oh my goodness, it's the greatest place ever. But my experience is, you know, I have to think about where I'm going and what I'm doing.
Yep.
And that's uncomfortable at times. So I want everyone to be aware of the full spectrum. There's 360 degrees.
Yep, I agree. And that's why, you know, I think we shouldn't be afraid to ask people to share their stories. And if someone's not comfortable doing that, respect that. I'm one that if you want to ask me anything, I'm an open book. So don't ever be, you know, fearful of asking me anything, because I'll share that. But no, I appreciate that comment, because yeah, I mean, not the traditional field trip where you just go and goof off, but if you're really interested in learning about differences and getting involved with the community. And remember too, I think there are a lot of good things right now, even online, that you can volunteer at the Y to do tutoring or something like that, or you know, an after-school program that caters to diverse students. You know, I've done those before, and you know, have just a really cool experience with that. So I appreciate all those comments, because we certainly want to find ways that really bridge and continue the development, and not you know, just promote discrimination or prejudice in a different fashion. Good. Other thoughts? We went over two. I love this.
I have a question for you. The whole time that you've been talking, I've kind of been thinking, man, this is a really uncomfortable subject for a lot of people, I would think. You know, to voice your own, for lack of a better word, discriminations against a certain group of people or type of person or whatever, that can be extremely difficult to voice that. In what ways would you get your audience or your group to open up, to feel comfortable to share?
Well, I think one of the things, like I had you all do, and I wanted to make it very clear up front. Whatever you wrote, if you wrote anything, that's your business. I mean, because this issue is really about your values, beliefs, attitudes. And so that's something that you work on the way that I do too. I mean, some things I don't want to admit either, because they just sound so horrible to articulate them. But I think part of it is, you know, finding, you know, it's kind of like, I think of it a lot, almost like the 12-step programs. I mean, those are very fearful situations too, but somewhere you've just got to find that place where you feel comfortable to take that first step to share. You know, like my student I was sharing with, I mean, she was just so embarrassed that she just cried and cried and cried because she thought I'd hate her. And I think finding a person too that you feel comfortable with talking to about it. Like I said, if you ever want to come talk to me, I've heard it all. Nothing shocks me, and I don't say that lightly, but I mean, I've been around the block enough where, you know, I've heard everything, and you won't ever feel embarrassed around me admitting something, if that's where you want to begin. Or again, find someone that you're close with, that you can just start, and maybe both of you share too together, and just, you know, what's something you want to work on, what's something you want to work on. I mean, I think those things work as well. Start by reading. You know, that can be a good way to do it. You know, read some good sources, and maybe you don't even need to have the conversation with someone. Maybe you just get knowledge from good materials that you read, and can start working on changing certain mental models from there. I think there are just different ways. But yeah, we need to feel comfortable. We shouldn't someone who is wanting to improve themselves around issues related to diversity, equity, inclusion. We should welcome those. We shouldn't, push them away. That will happen, but that's the only way we're going to learn. I mean, that's the only way, is by sharing stories, listening to stories, asking questions about stories, and doing the best that we can to empathize with experiences. You won't ever know all my experiences. I won't ever know all yours, but I can certainly respect it, and you can respect mine. And I think that's, a big place where we begin.
I definitely look forward to attending maybe one of your workshops that you were talking about, the Black Lives Matter versus All Lives Matter and things like that. There's a lot of relevant things going on in the media today. I mean, anything from like white privilege, Blue Lives Matter, all those things, those are very relevant things for the time that we're living in. And I was actually thinking about earlier, and this is something that was relevant, 9/11, people got really afraid of a certain group of people, either Arabic or whatever. I mean, I had friends, and
it was just brown in general.
Yeah, that just they may not even be that race, but because they look like it, people are afraid of them. Or look at them, or if somebody's wearing a burqa, they're like, oh my gosh, what's gonna happen? I had a lot of like-minded people in my life, and then I had a personal experience with one of them, and I mean, I use that. I experienced such kindness from this person, and you would have no idea how much it changed my view of the entire group of people. It's like and you should never live life in absolutes. Not everybody's bad. All cops aren't bad. All Black people aren't bad. There's bad white people. There's bad Chinese people. Yep. It's don't put everybody in a box, and it drives me crazy. So I'm just really looking forward to some of your future workshops. I think those are good, and the more we talk about it, the more that change can be made, I think.
Just one more thing I'll say, and this is me, this is Stephen. I'm not trying to push anything, on you. I make a conscious choice, even though we were a Channel 9 family, all, because of Gary England's weather in Oklahoma City. I get told all the time, my grandmother would roll over in her grave if she knew I wasn't watching Channel 9 any longer. That's only because Gary England wasn't on there. But nonetheless, I watch Channel 5, and I purposely watch Channel 5 because it is a very diverse news group. There's Hispanic people. In fact, one of the newscasters, Zach Rael, he grew up in Santa Fe. So I've chatted with him. We're friends on Twitter. We talk about Santa Fe, missing green chili cheeseburgers. But then there's African American. I really like the general manager and some of his editorials, and I think he's been pushing to challenge our thinking about how we see events that are happening right now. I really do encourage you to find sources that are diverse. You don't have to agree with everything. I don't agree with everything, but at least diverse enough where you've got this nice pool of information, and then you sort it out for yourself, what's best for you. So that's just one of the small things I did when I moved here, was I really liked the diversity of Channel 5 in Oklahoma City. So anything else? Well, thank you very much. This is cool. We went over longer than the other group. We went over 20 minutes. We had a good discussion.
Nice job, Stephen.
Thank you.
Yay.
Well, give yourselves a hand too. You all deserve a hand. So feel free to come and find me, call me, send me an email, whatever. We can hop on Zoom or Teams or whatever if you want to talk to me more about this. Have a good rest of the day, and we will see you soon.